Hello, and welcome to the Alabama Public Health Training Network. Welcome to one of the most important trainings you will attend this year, Ending the Silence. It's not too late. We're going to listen, act, think, and educate. Through a new partnership between the Alabama Department of Public Health and the domestic violence and sexual assault programs across the state of Alabama, information will be provided to potential victims throughout all family planning clinics within health departments in Alabama. A pilot project is being launched in conjunction with the Family Sunshine Center and their 7-county service area. My name is Tonic, and I'm the Executive Director of the Family Sunshine Center, and I am more than thrilled to be with you today. Our presentations will be centered around the basics of each of the types of victimizations, the barriers to accessing services, and trauma-informed care. We have with us experts from the Alabama Coalition Against Rape and the Alabama Coalition Against Domestic Violence to present this information. Attendees will leave with an enhanced current knowledge of domestic violence, sexual assault education, and the available resources allowing for improved trauma-informed care of patients within the clinic setting. If you have a question about anything being discussed today, please call or email during our broadcast. The phone number and email address are on your screen now and will appear again later in the program. Also, the handouts, sign-in sheet, and evaluation are all available online. You will need to register for this program in order to access those materials. Continuing education credits have been approved for nurses and social workers for today's program. And in order to receive credit for this training, you must watch the entire program, then complete and return the sign-in sheet and evaluation. While content may continue to be relevant, continuing education credit will only be awarded for 2 years for nurses and social workers, expiring on April 30, 2021. If you are watching this program on demand and want to receive a social work continuing education certificate, you will need to complete the social work test and send it in, along with your sign-in sheet and evaluation. If you're watching the program live, there is no social work test required. For social workers, if you are watching this program live, it qualifies for classroom hours. If you are watching on demand, it is considered to be non-classroom hours. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our presenters today. First, we have Tiambe Barnes and Kathleen Connolly with the Alabama Coalition Against Rape. They will provide information to enhance your understanding of sexual assault and trauma-informed responses to sexual assault. Also, Latricia Bryant and Cynthia Williams are with the Alabama Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and they will provide Domestic Violence 101 training and discuss what it means to be a trauma-informed program. So welcome everyone, and let's get started with Tiambe.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to start with what is sexual assault? As we begin, I want to let everybody know that sexual assault is not the same as domestic violence. We are here today so that we can help individuals understand what that means and what that looks like. Sexual violence. You will also hear me use the word sexual assault, rape, and sexual violence interchangeably. They are any voluntary sexual act in which a person was forced to engage against his or her will. It is basically someone pushing themselves upon someone, and it can include oral, anal, or vaginal assault. It can also include threat, coercion, or physical force. There are many types of rape as well, which includes acquaintance rape, date rape, gang rape, stranger rape, and drug facilitated rape. And when we think about what sexual assault is and how it differs from domestic violence, we have to make sure that people understand that domestic violence is physical. Had I come in here today with someone who had just gotten into a fight last night with my partner, you all could see it. However, had I been sexually assaulted, no one would know. Maybe you would know by my behavior or something like that, but it's not something that you can see on the surface. So we have to make sure that we're very cognizant of that and what that looks like and how we respond to that. The concept of sexual assault, a lot of times people think, oh, sexual assault is it's simply sex. No, it's not sex. It's about violence. It's rooted in power and control. It's not something that someone just wakes up and say, oh, someone's going to rape me. No, it's not like that. It's something about power, control, and it's rooted in that. And it has very devastating effects on people and long term that sometimes you cannot see. It affects people's social, mental, their ability to work, and also how they just function on day to day. There's also other parts of sexual assault. You have sexual violence, sexual harassment. That's any unwanted attention and advances from people. Also, that you're not comfortable with. And one of the things we try to talk about more so than anything when we talk about sexual assault, we talk about consent, helping people to understand what is consent. Consent is just simply having a clear and consent, a clear and sober yes. Basically, if someone has been drinking, they're drugged, they can't really truly give a yes. They can't say that, oh yes, I'll engage. So we have to make sure it is clear and people can understand what that is. A lot of people often ask, well, how do we see sexual violence as a problem or sexual assault as a problem? It's a big problem. We talked about it already, that it affects people in different ways. But number one, it violates a person's human rights. It's a trauma. It's a traumatic experience like she will talk about in the future, but it affects people and how they function. And it affects all of us because we don't know what people are dealing with. And we have to make sure that we are able to help them and get them the assistance that they need. And here is the motto. If you're watching or following with the PowerPoint, here it is when we talk about it affects more than just the person. It affects our society, community, relationships, and individuals. This is a social ecological model. And so we have to know what that means, what that looks like. We want everybody in our society to be able to function and be able to do the things that they need to do in order to be successful. So we have to know it's just not about how that person, but it affects everyone. The cost of sexual violence, again, if someone has trauma and they haven't been able to talk to anybody about it, what happens to them? They withdraw. They may not be able to go to work because they're scared. They may not be able to they may not be able to work. They may lose their homes, their friendships, because it is a traumatic experience that oftentimes people don't always talk about it. Some of the statistics that happened in Alabama in 2015, there were reported 1,988 rapes were reported in Alabama. That is a 5% increase from 2014. And so we have to know that there are things, and that does not include the number of people who have not reported. And if we also think about it, for every one woman or person who reports, there are at least 6 women who do not. And when we talk about men, there are at least 22 men who do not report. So we have to know that it is a traumatic experience, and it's something that that people don't always report. It's it's a real hard thing for people to report. And one of the things I want to also highlight, because we're all professionals and working in different settings, is that also we have another issue in Alabama. Alabama is #1 in the nation for teacher-student rape. And a lot of people say, what do you mean about that? It goes in the news a lot of times and they talk about teacher-student sex, but it's teacher-student rape. And so we have to make sure that we understand what that is. So when someone comes to a young person, we can't just assume that they are, oh, that's just you're attracted to your teacher. No, that's not healthy. We have to know that that is a problem as well. We're utilizing events like this so that we can break down the stigma. And people say, well, I'm a professional. I do this for a living. I know. But we all don't always know how to respond. So we have to be making sure that we're taking time to think about what it is we're doing. We can't just say, oh, I believe you. Okay. But we have to make sure that people know that when they come to you, that you're serious about believing them and helping them get to the help that they need. And that is the stigma. And there are also stigmas around it because we have something called rape culture. People talk about, oh, it was the victim's fault. Well, what were you wearing? Well, why were you there? Those are not questions that should be asked. Those are things that we have to make sure that we break down those stigma. It's about helping people to get where they need to go. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but most of the sexual assault cases, it is the most underreported crime. 60% of sexual assault still goes unreported. And a lot of people say, why? If it's so, we hear about the Me Too movement, the church too, because people are afraid. Sexual assault is rooted in power and control, and we have to make sure that people are feeling safe, and we know we have the access to the resources that can help them be comfortable in saying what they feel, what's going on. And we also have to make sure that people know that when they think about rape, rape is not about stranger danger. 73% of sexual assaults were perpetrated by a non-stranger, meaning that it was a family friend for children or people they knew, someone they were dating, a relative. So we have to know that it's not just stranger danger, that it's right there. They probably knew the person and never thought that that person would hurt them. Victims of sexual assault are more likely to suffer from depression, PTSD, self-medicate through alcohol, drug, and many are sometimes contemplate suicide. So one of the things that we have, we try to keep we try to make sure that everyone knows that we have to be able to help survivors. We have to help victims and survivors know that it's okay. If something has happened to you, it's okay. We believe you, and we can help you. We can help you get the help that you need. And we have to break down the myths. In particular, no really means no. Well, you were wearing, or you were drunk, or you were out partying last night. Oh, you wanted it. No, 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 no. Someone can't make a decision. No really means no. You have to ask for consent. And so in the work that we do in learning how to respond, we also have to talk about prevention, letting people know that you have the right to choose what you want. And there's another thing when people also talk about, well, he or she did not fight back. Cooperation does not mean someone consented. If someone had to fight or they left the scene or something like that, that was their method of trying to survive. It's about survival, and people have to do what they need to do in order to survive. So don't assume that cooperation meant that they consented. It did not mean that. That was a method of survival. And so what we ask you to do is just educate yourself on the issues. Educate yourself on what you can do, how you can tell people about prevention, how to respond, and know that sexual assault is rooted in power and control, and that people need to know that you believe them. Start by believing.
Kathleen, we'll move to you now.
Hi. I'm really excited to have this opportunity. As is known by everybody who knows me, I can't talk enough about rape and trauma because I really think it's something we all need to understand, because even when we're in a helpful place and we're wanting to help, sometimes we can put our foot in it because we don't understand what meaningful access is and what trauma is and how that all is woven inextricably in with the crime of rape. You simply need to know all of these things to be able to be effective in service. I want to talk just a little bit about access, and we do full-day trainings around meaningful access, so I apologize for just skimming on the top of the mountain here, but just a few things to think about when you talk about wanting to serve all people who are rape victims and survivors. The first thing is it's really critical, and ADPH, look at your materials, that you do things and put out materials that are gender neutral. For far too long, we've put out materials around both crimes that very distinctly make victims and survivors she, perpetrators he. So what happens is anyone who the perpetrator and the survivor or victim was the same gender feels like, oh, that's not me. Male survivors and victims feel like, oh, that's not me. And we're doing this, right? We're stopping people from even reaching out to our services, even picking up the phone to call a hotline, because we've already kind of communicated, not you. So we want to go through your materials, and I'm happy to just send them to me if you want me to look over them. And think about how you could change the language. Instead of saying she, or when a woman, when someone, when a person, a victim or survivor of rape, you know, there's all sorts of other language you can use. It doesn't send that subtle message. Not you if you're not female, and not you if your perpetrator was not of the different gender. Make sure as you're working with people, and my understanding is our audience is social workers and nurses, make sure you get people's names right. Sometimes we do, and Tiambe probably experiences this more than me, where people struggle with your name. So they're like, well, Miss T, or, you know, shrinking it down, which Tiambe does go by T, so that would be okay, but not if she hadn't told you. I go by Kathleen, and because that's my name, I didn't just pick it out of a hat. But if somebody's talking to me and calls me Catherine, and that's not a huge difference, right? There's just something, if it's just at a grocery store or something and they say, oh, thank you, Catherine, I say, thank you. But if I went into a counselor or to talk to a nurse about something this painful, this difficult, this important, and they said, Catherine, you know what happens? I know you're not listening to me. It's okay. If somebody's name is difficult to pronounce, ask them, write it down, do whatever you have to do, but that's that first step. Again, much like the gender, right off the bat, you put up a wall, you say, yeah, I'm not that interested. I mean, Tay, Faye, whatever, you know, that's what we're doing, right? We don't want to do that. And around language, semantics, meaning, and T touched on this, use criminal language for criminal acts. When you are charting someone if you're a nurse, or writing down what happened as a social worker or other first responder, don't say, so then you went in the other bedroom and you had sex, you made love. No. And then you forced, this person forced their penis inside you, or this person forced you to spread your legs and performed oral sex on you, whatever it is, you use criminal language, because this isn't consensual, this isn't sex, this is a crime. And I wish I had thought this up myself. I didn't. I heard it from someone who's a great trainer, and I thought, oh, I'm stealing that everywhere I go. When you see someone drowning, you do not yell out, hey, someone's involved in non-breathing swimming out there. No, right? It's not the same thing. Drowning looks like swimming, and you're in the water and you're moving, but it's a totally different thing. And rape isn't sex. Rape is criminal. Rape it needs to be distinguished as such. And again, you can get people you start encouraging them to minimize it without realizing it. Because making love isn't that big a deal, right? Having sex, well, I've had sex before. Maybe I've even had sex with that person before. Rape is a felony, and so that's what we need to call it. The terms victim and survivor, some people will identify as survivors. If someone tells you they're a survivor, don't tell them they're a victim. But don't rush right in and go, you're a survivor, if someone says, I was just raped. Because many times, especially in the early part of going through a rape, the last thing you feel like is a survivor. I mean, you are a crime victim. I tell people I was burglarized a few years ago. No one has yet to call me a burglary survivor. I was a victim of that crime. And so we want to make sure that we give the right import, that we acknowledge the seriousness of this crime, but that we also respect, that people may want to identify as survivors, because it's certainly a more positive term. Use people first language when you're dealing with people with disabilities. I am working with a survivor who has autism. I'm working with an autistic. We want to get away from that. And when you need an interpreter, get an interpreter. I've seen people like, I took 6 months of sign language. This is not the time when someone comes in who's been raped. And don't use people's family members or children as interpreters, with the very limited exception if you're just trying to assess immediate safety. No other reason. Get an interpreter. It's critical because I'm bringing you, I mean, you need to think of this as this may be the worst thing that's ever happened to me. This may be the most important story I've ever told. It's certainly going to be up there in my top 3 or 10. And how are you going to help me if you don't know what the problem is? How are you going to help me if you don't truly understand my situation? So make sure you're really hearing. And don't infantilize elders or people with disabilities. Treat adults like adults. I hope this person isn't listening, but the person who sent me a text calling me lollipop this morning, as an older person, I mean, I really thought, I think before my hair turned white, she would have called me Kathleen. That can be off-putting, right? Some of you out there in viewer land, nobody in this actual room, may be older. And that thing we do around, oh, honey, look at you eating your whole waffle when you're at a restaurant. No, we don't want to do that. Right. When somebody tells us about a rape, we don't want to be, oh, precious, I'm so sorry for you. No, you should react with people who are elderly and people with disabilities. Hear their truth and don't focus on what's different about them. Let's see, as usual, I spend 100 hours on every slide. Trauma-informed victim-centered care is our goal. And real quick before I go into this, I just want to ensure, because everyone listening is a first responder, make sure you are aware that you may be traumatized, particularly as you hear multiple stories of rape and domestic violence. Vicarious trauma, secondhand trauma. There are types of trauma that can really impede your ability to help people, and they're also very, damaging to yourself. So check in with your supervisor if you start to feel that that's backing up on you. And I would encourage all the supervisors out there to check in with your employees and make sure that people are getting appropriate mental health consults and counseling sessions to deal with the trauma of listening and helping. So I think rape crisis centers have been doing trauma-informed victim-centered care for a long time, and many nurses and social workers have too. Instead of being like, what's wrong with you, we're saying, what happened to you? And secondarily, how can I help? When we think of trauma, it's just something that overwhelms us emotionally, physically, mentally. We simply cannot cope. And that is going to vary from person to person. They've done studies, there's historical trauma. Many of you may have heard of adverse childhood experiences, where if we've had experiences growing up, witnessing domestic violence, being homeless, having poverty and not having enough to eat, many things that are adverse childhood experiences, it'll be more difficult for you to cope with trauma. The more trauma you've experienced, many times, the more you're overwhelmed. So it's an individual thing. It isn't like, well, there's this much trauma and that's what people can handle, and when it's this much, that's too much. For me, it may be this much. For you, it may be that much. And for you, it may be virtually none. But it's always trauma if someone's coping capacity is overwhelmed. And you'll see it in a lot of ways, and as you're taking down notes, it's important to recognize what trauma looks like and what trauma does to the brain, because otherwise we may interpret this in a different way. Many times people who have been traumatized have really poor concentration. And I've seen people get frustrated when they're charting a case and the survivor's looking at stuff or messing with their phone. And it's easy to go, how important can this be? This person isn't even focused, but they're having a real hard time focusing. It has nothing to do with whether or not this happened or whether or not it was serious. It has to do with how our brain works on trauma. You'll also see people being really lethargic. And around rape, sometimes people, you have to remember, people are dealing with very little sleep. Their sleep cycles may be interrupted. They may have, if it's something that happened recently, they may have stayed up all night agonizing what to do. So that can add to the lethargy. Short-term memory loss, we're going to talk more about what that looks like. And self-medication is something we see, not in every case, but so often go hand in hand with trauma. So please, I caution you not to feel like, well, this person has a substance abuse issue. They may have a substance abuse issue, but it's a chicken and the egg thing. That substance abuse issue may have been born out of self-medicating to try and stop the pain of unresolved feelings around being raped. So that's what happens with trauma, that it leads many times to alcohol and drug use and sometimes abuse. And I do a lot of work in correctional facilities, and we see a lot of people who, when you look at the root of their incarceration, they were sexually abused or assaulted as children or as young people. They were self-medicating. They ended up committing crimes to fuel that addiction, and they're incarcerated where, you know, they're either not getting help or, worst case scenario, additional sexual assault. And people will shut down emotionally. Nurses usually refer to that as a flat affect, right? And that can be hard for us. When we see someone who's not responding, we're, well, shouldn't you be upset? Shouldn't you be crying? You shouldn't be anything. Everybody's different. The way we react to trauma is totally individual. And there is not a, yeah, I can tell by looking at your face. I've heard people say that. Well, I can tell when it really happened by how they behave. No, you can't. You cannot. When we've been traumatized, we react individually. And I always use the example of my ex-husband's one of 9 kids. 8 of them are boys, and they all look the same. And at their father's funeral, they were lined up like 8 identical-looking people. And 2 were crying. 1 was just sort of standing there stony-faced. 1, who's the politician, was literally turned around talking to people and sort of getting his comfort that way. Somebody was nervous laughing. And there were a couple other reactions. And who loved their father? All of them, right? So that's people who are as close to, you know, what would it be with 8 octuplets as you could get, all reacting very differently, people who had been raised the same. So when you see a rape victim survivor present one way, don't take that as this is what it looks like. It runs the full panoply. Okay. We also have, that I want to talk about briefly so you're aware of it, things that happen during trauma called tonic and collapsed immobility. We sometimes talk about there's fight, flight, or freeze, but there's literally freeze. It's not a choice. Tonic immobility, I mean, think of a possum. It is like you just almost can't move. People describe as feeling frozen, as feeling like they just, I was trying to move my arm and I even couldn't, like I was just paralyzed. Sometimes they can't make any noise. Extremities may go numb. This is not uncommon at all. When we start looking back at rape cases before we started really looking at trauma, we see, oh, we had lots of reports of what we now recognize is tonic immobility. And then there's collapsed immobility, which I've been doing, well, I rode a dinosaur to work the first day I did Rape Crisis. I've been doing it for decades, and I had not heard of collapsed immobility until about 8 years ago. People literally doze off almost. They lose consciousness briefly. So if you have someone who's telling you a story and they say, and then, I don't know, I think I fell asleep, that doesn't sound right. You think, oh, you've been drugged, let's get a urine sample, let's get a blood sample. But that's actually something that happens to some people after trauma. And if you're interested in seeing illustrations, go on YouTube and Google people passing out on scary roller coasters. There's endless footage of people, they literally just, and then they wake back up. And so people will have that experience during a rape, and that's part of trauma. So what do you need to know to be trauma informed? First, you need to understand that it is a physiological, neurobiological reaction, that the brain is affected from trauma, and that people, the way they're acting, you're not meeting someone when you see them right after being raped. That's traumatized. They're not themselves. Know that people's memories, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, that just because somebody's statements are inconsistent, sometime when we're taking notes, we, well, that's not the same, but it won't always be the same. And some decisions made after a trauma, they're going to just seem like such a bad idea. Like, why would you ever do that? But people, when they've been traumatized, can't always think clearly and can't always make a choice. Don't make the choice they would have made if they hadn't been traumatized. Back to my burglary, I walked through my house twice before I called my child, who said, "Mom, have you called the police?" And I went, "Oh, no, I didn't even think of it." And I can't even make a small enough how tiny a burglary is trauma-wise versus a rape. And I wasn't thinking clearly. So imagine, multiply that by 1,000,000. And we want to understand about just tonic immobility, collapse in immobility, and disassociation, which is that feeling of feeling like you're not in your body. And you'll have people say, "I felt like I was watching from the ceiling," or "I felt like I was kind of standing by myself watching." That is normal. No, we know that people experience and react to trauma very differently. And we understand these different reactions and the problem behaviors that are just people trying to cope. We all do what we have to do, right? Real quickly, how memory works after a trauma. I didn't want to do this here because we're on tape, but usually I like to take a jigsaw puzzle and throw the pieces all into the air. And then tell this poor young woman in the front, here, what's this a picture of? No box top and just some random piece. Not, because what would you do if you were solving a jigsaw puzzle? You get the four corners, then you get the edges. We all have the way we do it. But if you just get random pieces, how likely are you going to be able to put that puzzle together? No, right? But that's what your memory coming back is like after a major trauma. Here's this blue piece, here's a green piece, and as it comes back, what happens? Well, your story changes. So your memory consolidation and recall right after aren't good, and you're like, "I don't remember, I don't know." You don't tell a linear story, you're all over the place. And so that doesn't always sound like truth. When we train police officers, we really talk about this, but it's not. It's just that while the content's there, people get the memories back. And it's better, if possible, to talk to people after a couple days and give them time to have a sleep cycle and to consolidate those memories. People will come back in and say, "I know I said I didn't remember what color the car was, it was blue." And it just wasn't there when you first asked them, and it is there now. That does not mean anybody made anything up. Some things you may see with people who are struggling with long-term effects of trauma, that hyper-arousal. Tiambe knows I'm the queen of that. You know, where if you come in the room and somebody shrieks, people can be super, super jumpy, that they're re-experiencing either through nightmares, through flashbacks, through dreams. Sometimes that's triggered by smells or sounds or sights. That people, as you said, avoid, withdraw. They start separating themselves even from the things that would be helpful, right? Because our reactions aren't always logical. And they're pulling away from relationships and activities. And again, I mention it more than once because it's so important, because as a society, we're so judgy sometimes about drinking and drugs. But when it's self-medication, I'm not saying, "Oh, go to town, drink yourself into a coma." But we have to understand the roots so that we can help and not just, make a judgment face. Please let us know. I speak for both of us. We're the Alabama Coalition Against Rape. We want to help. Call us if you need assistance. Call us if you want training. We appreciate this opportunity. On to domestic violence.
So before we move to Latricia and Cynthia with the Alabama Coalition Against Domestic Violence, I would like to thank Tiambe and Kathleen for the information about sexual violence and trauma-informed care, and remind the viewers that if you have questions, please either call in or email those questions. I have a question that I would like to ask Kathleen, if you don't mind. You ready?
I'm braced.
So it relates to working with a victim with disabilities.
Right.
Who's a victim of rape. Can you maybe describe a situation where you have a person with disabilities who presents maybe at a clinic or at even one of our rape crisis centers? Are they generally accompanied by someone, and is it likely that that person may be the perpetrator And how might you deal with those situations?
Wow, we can do a whole training, but real quickly, although I use it too because there's no way around it, you know, that people with disabilities, there's a lot of, I have a disability, and no, I would show up by myself, but you know, there are many types of disabilities, and so again, that individualized approach. But if you're talking about someone who does have someone come with them, say someone with mobility issues who needs assistance getting there, someone with an intellectual disability, I think it's critical that we remember who our clients are. And this extends even to minor children, that sometimes we end up talking, so mom, tell me. It's like, you're not there for the mother, you're there for the child, and you're there for the person with disability. So, and the person may be the caregiver, though the caregiver may be the perpetrator, so you definitely want to be aware of that. But even if they're not, you're not listening to my story, you're listening to their interpretation of my story. Of course, if someone's nonverbal, sometimes you don't have options, but I would say to be really careful to interact with your client. And if you know, I like to always make sure I have some one-on-one time with a client, because how do I tell you that it's her if she's in the room with me the whole time? And this is another reason that I would emphasize with disabilities and with the deaf community. If you can't understand the person for whatever reason, you need an interpreter, because if you let the person that came with them, say a deaf person, sign, you think you're getting the story, but you're not. You're getting whatever she wants to tell you. If I'm telling her and she's telling you, I think it's really critical to make the focus, who is our client and how do I serve my client? And other noise in the room from other people, that's not what we're there to do. Does that help?
It does. Thank you, Kathleen.
Sure.
Do we have any questions from email or on the phone? Okay. So we'll go ahead and move to LaTrisha Bryant and Cynthia Williams with the Alabama Coalition Against Domestic Violence. LaTrisha?
Okay, good morning. We're going to talk about the dynamics of domestic violence, DV 101. So we're going to start with a few stats. Domestic violence cut across all racial, ethnic, religious, and economic groups. Approximately 97% of domestic violence victims are women. An estimated 2 to 4 million women are beaten every year by their partner. Battering is the single greatest cause of injury to women, more than auto accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. So what is domestic violence? It is a pattern of violent and coercive tactics. It is a pattern of controlling behavior. It is a learned pattern of behavior. It is the control of thoughts, beliefs, and conduct of the partner. And it's not only caused by batterers, it is only caused by batterers, not victims. It's nothing the victim can do to make a batterer abuse them. It's their choice. So domestic violence victims, again, are primarily women. Perpetrators, domestic violence perpetrated by women is frequently in self-defense. So if you see a lot of times, a lot of the prisons, there are women in there because they defended themselves against DV. Domestic violence is occurring in significant proportions in America. Domestic violence can impact the workplace. It is damaging physically and emotionally. It frequently becomes more dangerous and more frequent and more violent over time. So it does build up. So a victim's reaction to DV. Self-preservation is primary. They may see intervention as a threat to her safety. And she has sometimes, in order to survive, she has to show that she is in line with her batterer, that nothing is going on. You see sometimes where the police comes out to the house to investigate a DV, and a lot of times she would say nothing has happened, please don't take him to jail. Even though she may have physical signs of DV, they still want to protect the perpetrator, and by doing that, they protect themselves. So escaping domestic violence, a lot of people say, well, why did she leave? Why are you still there? If he's constantly doing this or she's constantly doing it, why won't you leave? Victims do not leave domestic violence, they escape it. This time, when you leave domestic violence, that is when the highest level of lethality is up there. That means those are signs that build and build and build to where leaving, you may be deceased, he may kill you, he may injure you. So it's very serious when they're talking about leaving. They have to be very, very careful. A lot of times we use what is called a safety plan. And sometimes they're not able to follow that, but a safety plan would give them options. Who do I call? Should I store documents with my best friend? Should I do this? You know, what is the plan for me and my kids to escape safely? So again, barriers to escaping domestic violence. Threats of retaliation, harm to children. A lot of times they threaten to harm children. If you leave me, if my family breaks up, we're all going to die. A lot of times, lack of support from community. A lot of times we have programs we have 16 domestic violence programs through the state of Alabama. A lot of times victims, they don't know the support is out there. They don't know that there's somewhere they can go, where they can turn to for help. And that is what we try to do, is to make everybody aware of what services are offered in their counties. Then sometimes system failures. A lot of times if they are arrested, the next day they're out and they're coming back to harass you again. Or if you're trying to get assistance and you're trying to go to your local DHR, and you have to be open and honest with them about what's going on in your personal life. But they can also backfire on you as well, because then they'll say, well, you're in a domestic violence situation and you have kids there, you have to remove those kids from that situation. But if removing kids is gonna cause me and my children to possibly be murdered, what do? I stay. Okay, another barrier to leaving is attachment history. It is easy to say, you know, you need to leave him, but if you love somebody, you invested in this relationship, sometimes it's just hard. You can't turn off 10 years or 20 years of love instantly. Religious beliefs. Sometimes it's against your religious to divorce. Sometimes you're there until death do you part. Children, you don't want your children to not grow up with their father. But sometimes, you know, the father is not a good person. But some people think that a father is better than no father at all. Intimidation and economic factors. You're a housewife. He brings all the money in. How do I survive? You know, I don't have credit. I've never had a job. I may not know how to take care of me and my children. So that is a barrier, because it's security, financial security. Okay, misunderstanding the law. If he says, I won't give you a divorce, I'll make it difficult for you. We've experienced that as well, where we see clients who are still going through the court system because the perpetrator will not show up for court. And also, no one will believe you. They say this all the time. And in our world, we always tell our clients, we believe you. That's the first thing we start off with. No matter what has happened, we believe you. So, the effects of domestic violence on victims. They can feel like they're hopeless. Nothing else I can do, nothing will fix this. Then sometimes you have clients who are angry. They may take their frustration out on you, but again, we take it because we have no idea what they've experienced. And we can't tell them how to respond to what they've experienced. They may fear a lot. They may be jumpy or edgy. They may have anxiety, because if you're going from your home of where you've been controlled, and then you go to the shelter, then you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to respond because I've been used to someone telling me what to do. It's difficult for me to make those changes and make those decisions for myself and my kids. All right, so this is the power and control wheel. This is a wheel that gives you a breakdown of how perps use control and power to influence their victims. They can use intimidation. They can use emotional abuse. They can use isolation. And we see this a lot, where they will separate you slowly but surely from friends, and then they'll take you to relatives, and it goes on to where you're only there, you only belong to them. They use children. Well, if you divorce me, I'm going to take the kids because I have a job. I've never been in trouble. They use that to try to keep you there. They use male privilege. I'm the man of the house. You should do what I say do. I control everything. You need to get in line. Again, economic abuse, taking the money, giving her an allowance, giving him an allowance. Just control in every aspect. So we just discussed that. Okay, So where do perpetrators learn this behavior? Sometimes it's learned through families. Sometimes it's learned through victimizations. Sometimes it's pop culture. Sometimes it's society. However, all of these factors do not give you the green light to abuse anybody. Just because you see it on TV, just because you grew up in a household where there was DV, that still does not give you the right to perpetrate that against your family. So again, excess and lethality. Again, threats of homicide or suicide, fantasies of homicide, weapons, ownership of the partner, centrality of the partner, separation violence. All of these things, when they start happening, we start noticing them, the perp is building up to where he's going to either kill her, kill himself, or kill both in the whole family. So this is why we assess these things and we try to figure out what's going on. And we train law enforcement officers as well to assess this. When they go out to on the call, they need to look for these signs to see, okay, I've been out here several times, and every time I've come out here, it has escalated. So we teach them to assess those situations to where maybe we need to figure out how we can get you away from this situation before we're coming out here on the homicide call. So to wrap up, DV it's caused by a need to have power and control over an intimate partner. It is caused only by batterers, not victims. We never victim blame. No profile for victims other than most are female. However, we have seen an increasing amount of males as well. Sometimes they don't report it due to feeling like they, as a man, I shouldn't be abused. I'm the man of the house, I'm a male. And they feel like we're gonna judge them, and we do not. We offer them the same services that we offer to our female clients. And victims do not leave domestic violence. Again, they escape it. You have to be careful. You have to have a plan. You have to have a second plan and a backup plan so that you can safely escape with your life and with your children's life.
Go ahead to Cynthia.
Okay.
Oh.
All right. There we go.
All right, again, good morning, and thank you so much for having all of us. I am Cynthia Williams with the Alabama Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and we're going to look briefly at trauma-informed care as it relates to domestic or intimate partner violence. Kathleen did an amazing job, amazing job in defining trauma, and so that is a working definition on my presentation as well. Quick point here, types of trauma in a domestic violence situation. We know that that is interpersonal trauma because it's interpersonal within their relationship. Usually there's also going to be intrapersonal experiences happening within the survivor. So she's coping with what's happening in that relationship, but that relationship with herself is going to be impacted as well. It's important to note, though, that coping resources are also going to be used up by an intersectionality of other factors. So you'll have that interpersonal violence within the relationship, that intrapersonal concerns within herself or himself, and then other factors in their community or society as a whole. So you may be dealing with a survivor who is dealing with poverty or living in a high crime area. Any of the isms, racism, ageism, ableism. So when considering how to engage in a trauma-informed framework, we need to consider not only the violence that's happening in that relationship in an interpersonal way, but also other factors that are using up coping resources. All right, so what does it mean to be trauma-informed? SAMHSA, which has a lot of great information on their website, describes a trauma-informed organization as one that realizes the impact of trauma, because we looked at some of the statistics earlier, and I'll look at some as well. They recognize that there are signs and symptoms of trauma in clients. They respond by integrating knowledge about trauma. So once you know the widespread impact of trauma in a human services field, it's almost impossible not to understand the need to incorporate that knowledge in how you present services. And lastly, we seek to actively resist re-traumatization. When survivors come into shelter services or programs, we need to do everything we can to make sure that they know that they are being cared for, that they're being believed, that the services are allowing for them to express what they've been through, but also that staff and anybody that interacts with them knows, learns, and is trained on how to recognize those signs and how to interact appropriately. All right, so Doctors Harris and Fallot have a system or protocol that they've developed on how to integrate trauma-informed services into care. And again, they feel like the virtue of the knowledge of trauma allows you to alter your services, because knowing that you have people who, because of the way, again, the survivors have current trauma, but if they have ACEs in their background, adverse childhood experiences, or they have been through other traumatic events, you may be dealing with a brain itself that cannot interact in the way that you want it to. So you realizing that the survivor is at one space, you want her to be at another space, but she's just not there yet. So the traditional model of how we provide services to victims of domestic violence centered around safety, which is if a survivor wants to flee, let's get her into shelter. Once there, him or her, let's make sure that they have access to legal representation, counseling, any of those tangible things that they would need. But the trauma-informed framework also encourages advocates to begin the process of building trusting relationships from the beginning. So while you are providing services, those tangible things that you'll need just to build a life, you also are helping them to begin the process of shoring up those psychological resources that will be needed. All right, so there are 5 core components, and as we go through each of them, I want you all to remember that these 4 things should be included in all of those domains. So the first thing is, for trauma-informed advocacy, you need to be inclusive. That means any type of relationship. If it's a romantic partner, then your services should include female survivors, male survivors. If a person identifies as transgender, that service should be inclusive, that you're using the right gender-specific titles when talking with them, religion, race, ethnicity, any sort of intellectual or physical disability, that services have to incorporate the inclusiveness of all survivors, that your programs are welcoming. Trauma-informed frameworks look at staff. So when you are even down to the hiring process, that you're asking people, what are your experiences with trauma? How do you feel about working with people who have experienced trauma? Can you work within that framework to provide services? That the services are destigmatizing. Begin conversations about trauma that give it the correct terms. Make sure that when you're giving information, you're allowing survivors to know that this happens, unfortunately, to a lot of people. And so we need to begin the language of describing that in terms, so we take away the stigma of these things having happened to that person. And lastly, that we're non-re-traumatizing. Your facial expressions, the tone of your voice. Again, the language, like Kathleen pointed out. The trauma survivor is reading all of that. And depending on their history, they may have been trained that I need to look at who is interacting with me, how they're interacting with me, because I will need to tell what my next move will be based on how you interact with me. And I know that's heavy and that's a lot to consider, but that is part of it really is part of engaging people, period, I think. Not just in advocacy, that you're aware of how you interact with them may then bring up stuff within that person. All right, so 5 core components. All right, so again, destigmatizing information. If you have a survivor who's grown up in a home where violence has been normalized, and they have had things happen to them, and they may have even gone to a trusted caregiver and said, this is happening to me, and what they get back is, what goes on in this family stays in this family. Mm-hmm. Don't talk about family business. So the survivor, if she has him or her has a history, they may not have the language to even describe the pain that they're going through. So when they come into services, we begin that process of educating them. And then depending on how much access they had to, because you'll have people who've been homeschooled, who have very limited contact with others. So they just may not know what trauma is. They just may feel like this is what happens in every family. And then they end up getting into a situation where they have violence in the current relationship. So the process of destigmatizing starts at intake. So you'll discuss the link between trauma, domestic violence, and then your mental and physical health. You'll talk about the things abusers do to gaslight. Abusers are very good at convincing a survivor that there's something wrong with them, and it helps them justify their behavior. So you begin discussing, for example, a survivor will say that there was money in the bank, and I knew there was money in the bank. And then there's no money in the bank, and he tells me, well, you must have taken the money. She doesn't even have access to the money. But what he's doing is creating, again, those interpersonal concerns where she's like, well, did I take the money? Because he's creating a space within her where she has to question herself. So we can point out, and advocates can point out, that no, the money was in the bank. But in order to control you, he had to convince you otherwise. So having those conversations from the beginning. All right, so ACEs. Hopefully everyone has heard of the ACEs study. And ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It was a study done in the late 1990s, early 2000 out in California in conjunction with the CDC. And basically what it looks at is whether things that happen to us in childhood have an impact later on behaviorally, with our mental health, with our physical health. And the ACEs measure asks 10 questions. And the questions will be like, before the age of 18, did a person in your life make you feel through verbally abusing you that you weren't anything? Did a person in your life before age 18 often or very often touch you in a way that was inappropriately? And so it just breaks down those questions as experiences that are happening to you. And then it looked at whether or not those experiences were correlated to later problems with your mental health, physical health, or sort of behavioral outcomes. Now, some of the literature even says it's a causal relationship, which for me, when I read that, was like, okay, adverse childhood experiences can cause suicidality later, but other research says correlated, so that's what I included. But ACEs are very common. Nearly 2/3 of all adults have at least one. There are other questions like, when you were younger, did your parents separate or divorce? So that's going to be a lot of people. But the idea is that things that happen to you in childhood have an impact later on, and definitely when it comes to violence. All right, so second core component, adopt programs and services to meet survivors' trauma and mental health related needs. We know that, again, there's going to be a tolerance level for some traumas, and it's going to be individualized. But we know for the vast majority of us, if we have traumatic experiences happen to us, we're going to at least temporarily have some sort of mental health impact. So once you start having those conversations about trauma, you then make sure that there are services in place to meet those mental health related needs. Programs cannot screen out for psychiatric disorders. You cannot screen out. If a survivor comes to the program and they have a current mental health crisis going on, you do link up with services, but you can't screen out for even the previous psychiatric history. You have support groups and house meetings on trauma. Again, giving that information. You support survivors' efforts to advocate on their own behalf. Services should, from the beginning, empower survivors to make choices for themselves. Because the idea is to get the services and then be able to move forward with your life. So that begins by developing that trusting relationship from the beginning and empowering them to make choices that are good for them. Again, creating opportunities for survivors to discuss their responses to trauma. I know I've said this a lot, but conversations like this even help us destigmatize what is happening behind closed doors. And it helps empower survivors to know that what happened to you, unfortunately, is not something that just happened to you, but there is an awareness that it happens to other people and that there are normal reactions to it, And so once they know that, that allows them to not feel so isolated and alone. Ask a survivor, this happened to you. How has it changed you? How is this impacting your life? What are your feelings about it? Okay, how has it impacted your relationship with your children? All trauma-informed advocacy for domestic violence and intimate partner violence should be culturally competent. We have to recognize that people do not exist in a vacuum, that they come from communities and families, and they have their own set of norms in the way that they do things, and that we are offering services that allow for that to be expressed. Okay, so consequences of trauma. I guess about a month or so ago, Alabama had its human trafficking summit, and Mr. Guzman was the keynote speaker. And he actually was, it was an amazing speech that he gave. He has survived childhood sexual trauma. He was actually kidnapped in another country and brought over here. And he talked about some of the behavioral things that you'll see with victims of trauma, and how we're reading it as being difficult when really what they're doing is surviving. We know that from a biological standpoint, the alarm system that we have to respond to threats is not working properly, right? We have just about every system in the body responds to threats, but we know the limbic, endocrine, and the peripheral nervous system all are just thrown out of whack. Because it's one thing if you're walking in a forest and you see a bear and your body responds. It's another thing if the bear comes home every night. You're constantly responding. So your system is thrown off. So recognizing not only biologically that there are changes, but behaviorally, trouble concentrating, impulsive, like Kathleen said, numbing, disruptions in memory. The survivor probably is giving you the information that they can at the time. And so it goes back to us being able to engage as advocates in recognizing those things. Resources and referrals are another core component. Refer out for things that the survivor may need. You know within your program that there may be limits to what you can offer, but that you're always willing to say, okay, I need to reach out to this organization or this agency to make sure that the survivor gets all of the services that they need. Again, discussing the process of healing, understanding each survivor's response is unique, culturally relevant. Check and self. All right, so as an agency or a domestic violence program, staff is going to be huge. You as an individual person within your agency will need to work on, what trauma means to you, what your previous reactions to trauma have been. How can I now incorporate this trauma-informed framework that requires me to be transparent, that requires me to be engaging and understanding the backgrounds of people who've been through trauma, your own reactions. How do you make thoughtful and professional decisions in the moment when you have someone who is angry, who is cursing, who is not responding to your questions, who is not engaged? What do you do as an individual advocate to move past the parts of you that may pop up when somebody gets smart with you? That you don't then turn around and be like, no. That you understand that what you're getting is probably a reaction to what they're going through and you don't take it personal. So creating a culture within your organization that allows open communication between staff and then staff to survivor. You reflect on how this work impacts your life. Am I getting vicarious trauma? Am I getting compassion fatigue? That you're able to do that self-awareness. That what do you do within a program if every service you're providing to survivors is going well, but there's conflict within the agency? What is your plan to deal with tensions that arise? Because that will happen too, because we're human, but also because in a helping environment, it's stressful, it's inherently stressful. So what are you doing as a program to make sure that while you're taking care of survivors and providing these services, that you're also doing the same thing for the people you work with? All right, so one of those ways is, of course, to provide emotional safety, and you'll have a definition of that, but it's simply allowing a person to be who they are, and that they can feel at ease discussing things that are painful, and you make them feel like you see them, you hear them, and what they're saying is important. Emotional safety helps survivors manage symptoms It gives them a soothing place to talk about the things that have happened to them. It gives them a voice, comforted, and that they're in control. And if you think about the place that you work, what ways are, in a trauma-informed framework, administrators, managers, and other staff provide that emotional safety by allowing a space culturally that people can discuss things, and if there's conflict, we can talk about it. So that is important for survivors as well. Okay. So coalitions across the country are implementing trauma-informed frameworks and strategies for domestic violence advocacy. We talked definitely about the engagement piece, but there also is a facilities piece. What kind of paint do you have on the walls? What kind of pictures do you have? What television shows or news programs are on the television when survivors come in? If you have like a space where you're welcoming people, or your administrative building, or even for public health, what are the materials that you allow for people to read while they're waiting? So all these things are considered when you look at not just the human part of it, but also physically. Is there greenery? Is there natural light? So we want to make sure that the facilities themselves are calming and soothing as well. Be careful with shelter rules. Every agency has to have rules. Shelters have to have rules. But what you don't want to see happen is for survivors to feel like, I left my house where someone was telling me what to do all the time, and now I get to the shelter and I have all these rules too. So you have to have rules, but just allowing for survivors to be able to voice this is how I'm feeling, and then for staff to come back and say, well, this is the reason why, that you give them reasons for the rules you have in place. Barriers to implementing trauma-informed strategies, lack of staff training. Trauma-informed is training, all of the time. Because you have to give, the research and the science of it is changing all the time. So therefore you have to give people the information they need to even implement the trauma-informed framework. Buy-in from key staff. Staff has to buy in. People need to believe in this in order for this to be implemented. Ideological differences. If you're coming from an older school of DV advocacy, then for you the importance was the survivor is fleeing, let's provide shelter, let's get them housing, let's get them the services. This framework is a different take on that. We have to do all of that, but we also need to make sure, again, that we're shoring up those psychological resources so that the survivor is empowered to live independently from those services. Final thoughts. All right, trauma-informed is really human-informed. It is you interacting with another person, hearing them, seeing them, and making sure that they know that you're there for them. For many of us, it's the reason we chose a helping profession anyway, because you wanted to be there to witness someone being able to affect change in their own life. It's a reminder that the most important person in any moment is the person sitting in front of you. Trauma-informed strategies support the idea that we are not the sum of our past experiences, and that the things that have happened to us, we get to create the narrative. Survivors get to create the narrative. And lastly, and I think this probably is the most important point, lastly, the golden rule is always golden. Treat others as you wish to be treated. Right? Good clap for all of us. We did.
So thank you to all of our presenters. Fortunately, we've had some questions that have come in through email, and also some here in the studio audience. So Noxie, how would we like to, would you just like to read out the questions? And
yeah, we'll start with those and then do the studio questions. Will that be all right with y'all? Okay, our first question says, both drinking and assault took place. What are the best ways to encourage a person to file charges against that friend who has committed sexual assault? I don't know who to address these issues. I'm out there.
I, as an agency and as a person, I believe you should not be encouraging people to report. You should be helping people serving your client's best interests as defined by your client or your patient. So we're not there to go, oh, you really need to report. What if this person does it to somebody else? Adding guilt to the trauma. Think about that. Let people, you can give people, here are the pros and the cons, but whether there was drinking or not drinking, it's not our role as social workers, as rape crisis advocates, as nurses to encourage people to report.
Just as people, and this certainly isn't in the question, but you know, since this is very prevalent nationwide and in our state, some of these questions may not be from the patient staff perspective. They may be coming from private situations that they know about. Would your answer change?
It would not, and here's why. Because I've been doing this a long time, I have seen what I lack a term other than train wreck that has ensued when people have, the criminal justice response doesn't always work for people. And I think do I wish everyone reported? Absolutely. Do I think that would lower the risk of rape? I do. But I can't put you in that position of maybe having this complete disaster that re-traumatizes you in all sorts of ways. So no, my response would be listen to people and help them find what they want to do, not what you think they should do, but what they want to do. And you know, we all are operating with all the intersectionality, both of different cultures, but also just of we're a complete amalgamation of our individual experiences. And so I would, no, my answer's the same. I don't think we should be urging people to do anything except to get medical treatment immediately following a rape, whether or not they choose to report.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, and for the panel, can you tell us a little more about some of the most common indicators of abuse? I understand that just because a person may match one or more characteristics does not necessarily make them an abuser, but what are the most common warning signs that are worth looking out for or paying attention to? And I think, Latricia, you had some slides in your presentation that we might not have gotten to that might address some of that.
So are you asking as far as signs to look for in perpetrators?
I think, let me just read the question again. I understand that just because, stop. Can you tell us more about some of the more common indicators of abuse? And I think this person may be asking, what are the indicators to identify an abuser? Because she goes on to say that they understand that just because a person may match one or more characteristics does not necessarily make them an abuser. So what are the most common warning signs that are worth looking out for or paying attention to that may identify them as a perp?
Okay. So when it comes to identifying perps, it's no one size fit all. There are different characteristics. It can start off as something, like I said, isolation from your family. You have a best friend that you've talked to for years on the phone, and if he's home now, you tell your best friend, well, I can't talk to you because, you know, he's here. And then it stops from the conversation. Then you all stop going to the movies together, out to dinner. And also, you used to go to your family functions. You're there with mom. And mom, you know, every other weekend, you're slowly backing away. Mom, I can't come, you know, unless he's here, unless he wants to come, things like that. Intimidation. Sometimes you can be abused, and a lot of people think it's physical, but it can be emotional. You know, he can talk down, or she can put you down, hurt your feelings, say you're nothing, you're no good, things of that nature. Again, as Cynthia touched on too, economical abuse. I have the money is mine. And you can't have access to it unless you beg for it, or if you have to ask for it, you have to tell me why. You have to if you go to the grocery store, I need receipts to see exactly what you bought. Did you spend the money I told you to spend, or did you go under? Did you go over?
What about characteristics that maybe clinic staff might be observing in the waiting room?
Okay, so if you have a patient who normally comes to the doctor. They keep their appointments. They're always happy, cheerful, this great patient. Everybody knows this patient's name. Then all of a sudden you see the perp. They're there. They've never been there before. And so they're sitting there while you're filling out paperwork, that you're asking them questions. When you go up to the counter to pay your copay, they're up there with you. Even when you go to the back, normally you're going to the back by yourself, handling your business. But now she wants to go to the back. The doctor's starting to ask questions. Oh, well, yeah, you remember that time that you fell and hurt your arm? Things like that, touching. Because this right here may mean that I'm telling you you're talking too much, if that makes sense.
So the third question is, when you think a friend is being abused or they confide in you that abuse is occurring, what should you do and how best can you help?
Okay. So you can offer information. You can go to our website. However, it's up to the friend to make that choice. We can't, as a friend, I can't say, Cynthia or Kathleen, you have to go, and I'm going to call the shelter for you, because the shelter, you have to be the one to call and ask for help. You have to be the one who says, I need services, I want help. Nobody else can do it for you. And you have to be at that point where you're ready. A lot of times, we have people, clients who go to the shelter 7 times, 8 times, because they're trying to build themselves up. Okay, I'm ready. And then sometimes they get to that final 10th time, they're like, okay, I'm ready. But our programs allow, doors always open. No matter how many times you come, the door is always open, and we're going to treat you the same way every time.
Okay. I'm sorry?
Let's let the Coalition Against Rape address that as well.
Thank you so much.
So I just wanted to talk about something about grooming when you talked about, because that is something that is happening a lot, especially with child abuse. And a lot of times people kind of miss those signs when you think about grooming. Some of the things to look at with even in personal and professional is when children have someone paying special attention to them, whether it's male or female or something like that, not something in a I'm trying to date you per se, but a special gifts and fondness, those kind of things, because that's how child abuse it's not a one size fits all, but it's one of those things that we're learning that it's also rooted in the psychological abuse of young people, and it's the grooming. So when you see someone trying to, oh, hey, let me get that for you, or bartering with them, like if you do this for me, I'll do that for you, that kind of thing. So we have to be very conscious of that and what that looks like. I know we talked about a lot of articles and things, but I like to give people this documentary. If you have not seen Abducted in Plain Sight, it is a very great documentary to show about what grooming is and how someone can insert themselves into a family, a great family, quote unquote, whatever, and how they can manipulate people and cause psychological abuse, and the end result can be someone is being sexually assaulted in the process. So.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. As just a caveat to that, we all, as Department of Public Health staff, have training in mandatory reporting and age of consent. And just to share with you that may not know, when a patient walks into a family planning clinic, there is no age of consent that requires a parental signature. So regardless of the age of the minor, they can receive services in a family planning clinic with no parental consent. We also do training on mandatory reporting and provide guides with the DHR forms and that kind of thing. So we do try to keep our staff very up to date on the other side of this issue. We have another question. Oh, we have a bunch. Sorry. Have you experienced any involvement with the current domestic violence being perpetrated against immigrants in the ICE facilities?
Immigration.
The immigration. Mm-hmm.
Again, if an immigrant who is wanting to get services from the shelter, if you're trauma informed, you will be able to provide services. If not, then you will refer out. But, and I'm trying to understand if they're asking whether or not immigrant status would make a difference.
Yeah, she has some additional questions that go with that may
Okay.
be more helpful.
Okay.
You know, what do victims do that have no other place to go? And what kind of representation or access can be gotten from advocate coalitions like and shelters like yourselves?
If a victim or survivor comes to a DV program requesting shelter, then services are provided. If the legal component of that, I think it will depend in part on what services the shelter offers. Because some shelters and some programs will have legal advocacy, and therefore they can either, even if they don't have the background and the expertise to do the immigration part of it, then they can refer out for services. So again, if we're looking at trauma-informed, no matter what the survivor presents with, the services are going to wrap around and provide, and that includes any sort of referral for immigration or any other legal concerns.
I was just going to add, because that's great, but I think we also, when we were talking about what puts people at risk, I think it's important to recognize that someone's immigration status can put them at risk for both of these crimes, because with rape and domestic violence, if you're afraid to report, you're so much more vulnerable, right? If I know you're not going to tell, if I take your wallet, you're the wallet I'm going to take. And it's that same thing, and people are afraid many times if their, you know, their immigration status is, they don't want to report anything, so they are more vulnerable to abuse. So if you're looking at that.
We also have a secondary question to a question that was asked. The question is, I'm confused about not encouraging the person to report the abuse. Does not encouraging them to report it enable the perpetrator to continue their abuse longer? Is it acceptable to ask them if they have reported it to the authorities? And I think that referred to the drinking.
And if you're talking about rape, my answer would be yes, sadly. Lack of reporting may very well lead to someone perpetrating again. But when we work with clients, we're working with that individual and not saying, you know what's better for society? If you take it on the chin. We are working with them to help them in any way we can, and in their state of trauma to assist them. But yes, I think it's okay to ask. Have you reported it? If you want to report it, I can help you. I think that's totally great. But at the point they say, no, I don't want to, I know when you're getting a forensic kit collected, you don't have to report. And I think it's important to assure people, you can report later and we can help you. But not to try and nudge people into that.
Because there may be other factors that are associated with that person reporting. It may be some economic abuse, because if the perpetrator is in the home, the intimate partner abuse or something like that, what happens is then that person may become homeless. They may be hurt in some type of way. That's where the DV and the SA intersect right there. So that may be an issue as well. And if it's a child, they may, same thing. So you never know what are the risk factors of that person reporting. So it's always encouraged, let the person get there. Let them get there on what they feel is best for them.
Right. And know that they might not get there.
And that the consequences will be theirs.
Right.
So I think as a friend and support that you can provide the information, but you know, when you are looking at empowering them to make that decision, whatever happens legally happens to them. Whatever happens economically happens to them. Whatever happens socially happens to them. So there are, you know, so many different components that the legal part is just one. And so because the consequences will be theirs, I think it's important to allow them to make a decision about how that's going to affect their lives and be there, even if you don't move forward with the legal part of it.
Right, because we do want to be empowering all the time. So we can't say, well, we want to empower you. Oh, not that, that's wrong. Wait, you know, that, now you're making the wrong choice. I can't empower you there. We want to empower people, the full panoply. Whether, if they make choices that we think are good, or if, you know, and we put ourselves in the situation and go, I wouldn't do that. Well, then you don't do that, but don't visit that on others. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Thank you so much for all of your information. If we have other questions that come in, would it be okay just to forward those questions to you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. So as we get ready to wrap up, I'd like to give each of our presenters a chance to sum up their most important points from today. And we will start with Tiambe and go through the panel. And if you'll just take maybe a minute or two to sum up the most important points.
Okay, so with mine, I would just say prevention is possible. I work in the prevention area, and it is possible. It is never too early to talk to young people about what is going on. We have opportunities, so when we have the opportunity to talk to our young people, talk to them about good touch and bad touch. Take any moment that you can talk with anybody, whether it's professionally or personally, and let them know what's going on. The things we see in the media are real, and we can do something about that. And if you see something, say something. Don't just be a bystander. Intervene and say, no, that's not right. Let me help you. And even if it means that your intervention, being a bystander, is calling 911 or making sure that you file a mandatory report claim, please do so. Don't just allow something just to happen and we see it on the news later. Please intervene.
Well, since I was talking about trauma, I'm going to emphasize trauma isn't, I've been using this cup a lot as a prop. Trauma isn't this one thing that we're like, well, here's trauma, and then here's everything else we do. Trauma needs to be woven like a thread through the quilt of all your work. And I could be talking to our member center advocates. I can be talking to the nurses and social workers who are out there, law enforcement officers, every first responder that people who have been raped come in contact with need to be trauma informed, because you can do so much harm for the first thing if you're not, and because it's critical in being able to provide those services. And I think the other point I just want to make sure and leave people with is how critical it is to not leave ourselves out of that equation of trauma hurts people, and when people are traumatized, they don't function optimally. Remember, that's you too. So self-care is not an indulgence. Self-care is a necessity when you do direct services. And again, I'll leave it on encouraging you to focus on that.
So to sum up a little bit of what I talked about today, DV, whether you're male or female, if you're being abused by someone, it is never your fault. It's nothing you can do. It's nothing you can say to make them treat you the way they're treating you. It's important to look at warning signs. You may have that best friend who, you can see the signs. You can see that something's going on, and she or he may not want to discuss that with you. However, respect that. You can always give them, resources. You can give them, our hotline number. You can give them, our website that lists our shelters and where they are, the counties that they're in. There are a lot of resources that you can offer, but again, it has to be their choice. Even when they go to our shelters, they have to consent. They have to say, I want to opt out or opt in of services. Because again, at the end of the day, it's their choice. And the only way we can get that message out there and to educate the public is by having the trainings that we have. We have law enforcement trainings. We have advocate trainings. Because if you don't know, you can't help. If you don't know, you can't receive help. You have to know what's out there, what options you have.
Okay, so I'm going to say ditto to everything everyone else said, and especially Kathleen. Just understanding that all of us are damaged. Every human is damaged. There are degrees. All of us have trauma. The stats support that. That when you know something, and if you know you don't have the resources, to remember that there are other people willing to help you with that, and to speak up and to ask for help. If you can develop the self-awareness to do that, then what you're doing is spreading out into the world this gift that we all have of recognizing the humanity in each of us. So learn about trauma, and then once you know, spread out what you know, and then allow for trauma-informed care to spread out against the whole state. We want to make Alabama a trauma-informed state.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
That's awesome.
What a great way to end our training today by saying we want Alabama to be a trauma-informed state. Please remember that the Alabama Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Alabama Coalition Against Rape, if you go to each of their websites, they both have a wealth of information on them. They both have information about the crisis centers across the state of Alabama, as well as the domestic violence shelters across the state of Alabama. And they can help direct you to where you need to be. You ladies have been such a wealth of knowledge and information on both topics today, and I want to thank you so much for being here. This concludes our program. Please remember that you can refer back to the training and resources anytime on demand. And thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.